let's take another look at the representing integers here. So first, we're going to look at identifying integers on a number line. So they are plotted for you. You are going to write what the integer is. So here we have positive values. So when I'm counting from 0, I'm going to the right. 1, 2, 3, 4. That means the integer is plotted at 4. For number 2, we're dealing with negatives, so it works the opposite way. When I deal with negatives, I'm going to start on the right side instead of the left and counting backwards. Negative 11, negative 12, negative 13, negative 14. So that means our dot is at negative 12. Number 3, again, we're dealing with negatives, so I'm going to start on the right side to work backwards. Negative 31. Negative 32, negative 33, negative 34. So that dot is at negative 34. And number 4, again, we have negatives. I'm going to start on the right side. We can start at negative 10, or I can start at negative 15 and count backwards. Negative 16, negative 17, negative 18, negative 19, negative 20. So our dot is at negative 18. Okay, plot 6 on the horizontal number line. So we're talking about positives here. Our positive values are going to be to the right of our number line. So starting at 0, I'm just counting 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. So 6 would be right on the number line right there. Number 6, plotting negative 19. So negatives work in the opposite direction. So if I start at negative 10, this is negative 11, negative 12, negative 13, negative 14. That matches negative 15, negative 16, negative 17, negative 18, negative 19, negative 20. So right here would be negative 19. Number 7, plotting negative 12. Again, we're dealing with negatives. I'm going to start on the right side. Negative 10, negative 11, negative 12, negative 13, negative 14, negative 15. That matches up. So negative 12 is right here. And then negative 24, dealing with negatives again. We've got negative 10, I've got negative 20, negative 30. I'm going to start at negative 20, working backwards, going to the left. Negative 21, negative 22, negative 23, negative 24, negative 25. I'm going to keep going to make sure it matches. Negative 26, negative 27, negative 28, negative 29. So negative 24 is right here. 1, 2, 3, 4. Okay, then this part, where we're talking about opposites. This can be pretty tricky. What I'm doing is I'm remembering that negative signs and opposite mean the same thing. So as soon as I see this negative, I should see the opposite, the opposite, the opposite. For D, it doesn't have the opposite. That's not going to be an answer. Then I've got this second negative, which is another opposite. So I should see the opposite, the opposite. Part A doesn't have that, so that's not going to be an answer. And then we just have 9. So for B, it has the opposite of 9, so B is correct. C has an extra opposite. Okay. Number 10. What does negative 15 mean? As soon as I see that negative sign, I'm looking for the opposite. So I see the opposite, the opposite, the opposite. This negative is not right. I see a second negative sign. That tells me I should see again the opposite, the opposite. So for B, there's only one opposite, so there's only one negative. And then we just have 15, so it should be the opposite of 15, which is what D matches with. C has an extra opposite. So the opposite of 15. I forgot to, for part 9, what is the opposite of 9, or the opposite of a negative 9 is going to be positive 9. Here, the opposite of negative 15 is positive 15. Okay, number 11. I see this negative sign. That means the opposite, which means I can cancel out this negative here. And then we have another negative sign, which means another opposite, the opposite. So D doesn't work because there's only one opposite. And then it's just 4, so the opposite of 4. A matches. B has too many. The opposite of the opposite, that's 3 negatives. That does not work. What is the opposite of negative 4? The opposite of negative 4 is positive 4. For 12, what does negative 11 mean? Same thing we've been doing. We've got a negative, which is the opposite. The negative of 11 is not correct. We have a second negative. So we should have another, the opposite. B does not have that. It only has one negative. Then we have 11. So it should just be the opposite of 11. So A works, C does not because there's an extra opposite. The opposite of, it has an extra negative, 3 negatives. So that does not work. What is the opposite of negative 11? That is going to be positive 11. Okay, now looking at these keywords again. And I have a little cutout sheet that I'm going to use to help me as well. So, it says Juan made a profit of $75. If I look at the word profit and I look at my chart here, I see that profit is on the positive side. So that's going to be positive 75. Stephanie is $20 in debt. So I see the word debt. I look on here. I see debt on my negative side. So that tells me that debt is going to be negative. A submarine is 55 feet below sea level. So below sea level, I see below, and I see below sea level. So that's going to be negative 55. The kite is at an altitude of 30 feet. So looking for the word altitude, if I look on my chart, I see altitude on the positive side. So being at an altitude of 30 feet is going to be positive 30. Now let's look at the scenarios with 0, okay? Brad's grade went down 3% today. Looking at the word down, I see that on my negative side. So going down is going to be negative 3. What word is the opposite of the keyword? Well, the opposite of down, if I look on my chart, is up. So in some scenarios, when we're writing what 0 means, we can just use our opposite words, down and up. His grade didn't go up or down. So simply using those opposites. That's one way to do it. Let's look at 2 scenarios where there's a real world application of it. Jen is in her basement, which is 10 feet below ground. So I see the word below when I look up at my chart. Below is part of the negatives. So that tells me -10. What word is the opposite of the keyword in this problem? Well, the opposite of below is above. But this time we're talking about the ground. And remember, ground for 0 has a real world application. So the basement is below ground. Her room is probably above ground. 0 in this situation just means on the ground or ground level. Okay, another scenario where there's a real world application. At the beach, Mia saw a fish swimming at 5 feet below sea level. So below sea level, we've already identified as a negative. So that's going to be -5. And the opposite of that is above sea level. So we technically could say not below or above sea level. But anytime we see a sea level, just like with ground, there's the real world application where 0 is just at sea level.